Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Great Hall. Happy New Year, I think we can still say, and slightly early Happy New Year to those of you who celebrate it at the beginning of next week, because I can see a lot of you are here from China, so 欢迎你们. I'm delighted you're here to celebrate with us 100 years postgraduate research, 100 years of the PhD at the University of Bristol. And I'd first like to invite to open the event with a few words, Professor Hugh Brady, Vice Chancellor and President of the University. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's just fantastic, isn't it, to be here in person. It's been such a slog, slightly tedious pandemic. I hope you stayed well during it, but it is fantastic that we're beginning to open up now and get back towards normal. And I think that's hopefully by spring we will be there. As Robert said, we're gathered here to celebrate the centenary of the first PhD students graduating from the university. And from the first two PhDs awarded in 1921 to and I'm sure you all know this will be the PGR pub quiz questions. Botanist Lily Batten and physicist Leo Palmer. So from then all the way to the present day, we're celebrating the exciting and diverse work of our postgraduate research community. We'll also look this evening to the future to imagine what the next 100 years of postgraduate research might hold. And it's just wonderful that we're in the Great Hall for this really special event, because it represents the proud tradition of our university per se, and now we're celebrating that proud tradition of postgraduate training and scholarship. And gosh, maybe in 100 years' time, and maybe the way life expectancy is going, you'll be attending the 200-year event, maybe in Temple Quarter. Who knows? That wonderful old building in Temple Quarter. So stranger things have happened. From those first PhDs, we've now awarded over 11,000 PhDs to students from literally all over the world. Every continent, probably most countries, and of course from much closer to home. We also have a tradition of working with our city and region, and of interdisciplinarity and a culture of innovation and pushing back the frontiers of knowledge. And I suppose it's that tradition that we're building on, that many of you are part of, that I think will serve our university so well over the decades ahead. As we look to the future at the university, postgraduate research is just recognized as hugely important. Many of you will have participated in our recent fresh look at our university strategy and vision, and this was an exercise that my colleague Judith Squires led, and which I think was, given what was going on in our world, the level of engagement was fantastic. Out of that, there were a number of key messages, but perhaps if there was one consistent message from our academic community, it was the importance of PhD training, our need to do more in supporting PhD scholarships. And it's for that reason that we're delighted that the first major investment emanating from that plan is that we're announcing that we're increasing our investment in PhD studentships by 4.2 million a year. Now, that will enable us to offer at least 100 new studentships starting this autumn and over each of the next 3 years. And I've no doubt, given the feedback from and the fundraising success of Andrew Monk and his team in Darrow, in our fundraising division, that it will be many more than that. But it is a really important statement of our ambition and the importance that we place on this particular area. So it's an investment that will allow our schools and faculties to shape the next generation of postgraduate researchers. And it'll also open up even more opportunities to students from diverse backgrounds,
both at home and internationally, to join our cutting-edge multidisciplinary research team. So it will add to, for example, our Black Bristol scholarships, our Sanctuary scholarships, the International Scholarship Scheme, and many others that we currently offer. In a few moments, we'll be screening 3 short films co-created by our PGRs and artist Brony Gillard. Brony, welcome, and we look forward to seeing them. This artwork is the culmination of a year-long research project that's involved looking back into our records to understand the stories of our PhD students in those early decades. And the research team includes Lena Faraday, James Watts, now Dr. James Watts, Surangama Datta, and Sophie Osborne, who will be sharing their experiences of the project as part of a Q&A panel with Brioni later on, and chaired by Robert. They'll discuss the process of creation behind this work of art, and the team will also reflect on the early PhD pioneers, the impact that those pioneers had on Bristol and the wider world, and on their own contemporary experiences as researchers at the university. And this will be followed by a panel discussion on the future of the PhD, led by Tim Cole, director of our Brigstow Institute. And the panel will explore how research degrees are evolving to meet our current needs, and how they may look in the next 100 years in the context of our rapidly changing societies and universities. I find the next 5 years difficult, Tim, so I'm looking forward to that, and we'll be taking studious notes. Our panelists will be Kerry Facer, Joe Jenkinson, and Ben Miles, and they'll no doubt bring a range of interesting and different perspectives to that discussion. The story of research at the university across its history to date has very much been shaped by its postgraduate researchers, just as you are shaping the future of our university today. They shape the university itself, and their impact across the international research landscape and in societies across the world has been profound. And this event provides an opportunity to mark that impact, past, present, and future. So I hope you enjoy celebrating this with us this evening. And thank you for coming.
We're now going to watch 3 short films.
Landscapes, riverscapes, seascapes, and subterranean spaces. From water across land and down beneath the surface of the earth. From invertebrates to fish to mammals, their morphology, physiology, and anatomy. Researchers in botany covered an extensive range of flora, particularly either plants local to the Bristol area or where research into a plant could be used for agricultural purposes. Many of the students chose to focus on species or landscapes local to Bristol, such as botanist Rose Brasher's thesis considering the ecology of the Avon banks at Bristol, which made a great contribution to the knowledge of vegetation in this area. Yet their contributions were not limited to university research communities. Many undertook projects working with a range of partners, such as Lily Batten's work with the Ministries of Supply and Health, which had influential findings. There was a strong desire to pass on knowledge and involve others in research about the more than human world. such as Frederick Stretton Wallace's work in adult education and work with the Bristol Museum to preserve natural heritage, Rose Brash's student handbooks on ecology, Lily Batten's extensive work on seaweeds, and Leo Palmer's endeavours to record and proliferate speleological knowledge. These students' doctoral theses made important contributions to the knowledge of a variety of landscapes and their species, from water, across land, and down beneath the surface of the earth.
One of the things within that narrative of international and local has been to see the relationship between the local and the global. And for me, it is definitely one that I'm invested in, partly because I'm also part of that more contemporary version of that narrative. It's been very interesting to look at how, the researchers traveled from different countries to Bristol, or from Bristol and they went for field research elsewhere, given that time period and the political context.
The international and the local dovetailed in terms of research and context. Students came to Bristol from near and far. On the one hand, the university welcomed students from abroad at a time of historical significance, raising questions about cultural negotiations both within their research as well as personal lives. On the other, students from Bristol went on to produce research of global importance, along with travelling overseas for fieldwork. Welcoming international students meant that research developed was relevant not only within the local communities, but also within global contexts. Indian students at Long Ashton Research Station were in Bristol as a result of imperial links, as well as a concern about colonial development, agriculture, and food.
I do see some of my own experience in Olive Griffiths, who was a historian in the early 1930s, released a PhD in 1933 on religious thought in Britain. After her PhD, she became very interested in widening education and the Workers' Education Movement and the Workers' Education Association, and became a local history tutor. She decided to go down a sort of a wider access movement, a sort of widening participation movement. And that, I suppose, really resonates around how I view what we should be doing in academia and what we should be trying to do about getting more people from wider backgrounds into these conversations.
I think I would ask, why did you decide to do this? It must have been such a big step. I mean, it's a big step anyway, but for them especially, it must have been such a massive step, coming away from their homes. So I think these would be my two questions. One is like, why? What made you come all the way to the UK? And the other would be, how are your experiences different, or like how is studying here different from studying back at home, especially at that time? So yeah, I'd love to know that.
Bristol's international links were dynamic. The connections between the global and local would come to be forged within the space of research, as well as within lived realities.
Unfamiliar environments governed by strange power structures, new knowledge, continuing barriers, and risk could all combine to hinder the researcher.
I think it's hard to know what their experiences were, but I think there are parts of a postgraduate degree that are universal, and even though we only get the kind of final information about the thesis that's been examined, we get the final title and the examiners and that it was passed, there's always going to be a lot more to it than that, and that would not have been the project that they would have started off working on. There's always changes of plans, everything changes constantly, and you have to kind of embrace that change, I think. And I don't see why that would have been any different in the past.
For the 12 women, making up 8.3% of the postgraduate researchers in this period, there were specific challenges. Women's abilities could often be derided or ignored by male colleagues. Some, like Mary Carlton and Evelyn Joyce Perrell, researched in pairs for support, and their research often went in tandem for this very reason. Others, such as Marion Wiltshire, found female fraternity in university halls. Many women also struggled to convert their research into academic careers. Only 4 worked long-term within academia. Many married academics and assisted in research, but their recognition has tended to be as a wife first and a researcher second.
We need to show the stories of the people who have come before us, who were so capable and so amazing. I had no idea who Lily Batten was, and we've done all the work into her life. Her obituary talks about how she wrote this encyclopedia of seaweeds that was still being used 50 years after it was originally published, and how she did all this work in World War II to do with the shortage of agar that they needed. That's amazing. We all know about the big scientific discoveries that have happened, but that doesn't mean that there weren't other scientists doing really cool things.
International students had to deal with the unfamiliarity of Britain, as well as Bristol as an institution. The concentration of Indian students at Long Ashton Research Station may have reflected this difference, and students seeking a concentration of fellow researchers. All international students would not be equal in this way though, of course. Some, from Australia and New Zealand or South Africa, were in their imperial home. Others, from India or Egypt, would be still within the British Empire, but would have been likely to encounter racial prejudice.
Perhaps while I might not now feel like I would have to have another woman in the labs with me for my safety, as a support and a solidarity, and having someone that I feel understands, I think it is important that we look at the diversity of research groups, that there is that available support network.
What we'd like to do now is hear more from the wonderful team. Unfortunately, Sophie Osborne can't join us today. As requested by the university, she took a lateral flow test before coming this morning, and that's why she's not here. So if I could invite Bryony, Lena, Sungama, and James to come up. And I'd like to congratulate you on that wonderful work, which is a product of a year's intensive research by Team Bristol and then some months working with Bryony. And I should explain that our Bristol team first looked in depth at the first 20 years of the university's PhDs in particular. So, Bryony, can I start with you? Can you tell us what attracted you to the opportunity to work on this project? And what most struck you about the work you and the team have uncovered?
What attracted me to working on this project was, I often work collaboratively. It's something that's really important to my practice. So the opportunity to truly co-create a piece of work with a group of individuals from other disciplines felt like a really exciting and meaningful challenge, let's say. It definitely was a challenge. I think we did it. Yeah, and in terms of what struck me about the research, I mean, lots of things, and I think probably these guys will go on to say more about this, but I think I was really surprised at the breadth and diversity of the research during this period. Particularly, even though most of the PhDs were in the sciences, there's a real diversity in terms of what was studied. And also, I mean, the other thing that I found really interesting was and I think, again, this is something that will come up, the internationality of the research, but not just the identity of the students in terms of where they came from, but the reach of the research in terms of its application in a kind of a global setting. Both those things really surprised me. And I guess like the third thing, so I did make some notes today, is the civic intention behind the research. I mean, I'm not a historian, so I don't know a huge amount about this period, but I found it really interesting how kind of applied the research was for public good, let's say, in terms of not just being about, so a lot of the PhDs engage with like really local contexts and environments, but also local industries. So the concentration of PhDs around the soap industry or within agriculture at Lars. But also, some of the research is kind of what they went on to do afterwards. So in terms of people like Leo Palmer becoming a curator at Wells Museum, and Lily Batten's work with the Ministry of Health around AGAR. I found it really interesting to kind of think about those things.
Thank you. I mean, Sungama is a fourth year student in English. Lena is in her first year. Second now, time passes, in the University of Bristol, in history department, and Dr. James Watts is a lecturer in public history with us, having finished his PhD. It was last year. Yes, last year. And Sophie, who can't be with us, is a physicist, and sometimes very close second place for the 3-minute thesis, which you can see online. What have you three learned, do you think, from undertaking the wider research as well as working with Bryony?
I think that one of the most interesting parts of the project has been to get a sense of what PGRs researched about 100 years ago. And one of the very interesting aspects of working with Bryony was to be able to put our research into visual metaphors. So it made us think differently about the research that we had done about the PGRs, and it was quite exciting to, I think, navigate these two different planes almost. And I do research with, on graphic novels, so for me especially, I think the sort of connection between you know, the thoughts and the sort of creative process is quite, I mean, it's quite fascinating for me. So for me, that's definitely been one of the most sort of valuable experiences in that whole process.
It's interesting that we were doing this research for quite a while before Bryony then became involved in the project, and the three of us had done a lot of archival research, and in my experience, doing that archival research, it's then for a very kind of clear output of writing a thesis or writing an essay, and to actually, we wrote a report after doing that area of the output, but we kind of then left all of that behind, and we just went into the workshops with kind of what we'd taken from that research, not necessarily with any kind of clear arguments, just the things that struck us, the things that we resonated with, and kind of used that and like worked off that. So I thought that was really illuminating and a really interesting way to kind of reflect on our relationship to the material in the way that I think has not been a part of my postgraduate research experience thus far, at least.
I found it really interesting. I would reiterate what Bryony said about it being a very collaborative process to make this. It's not like we did some research and just sent it to Bryony and said, have fun and let's see what you do. You know, we did sort of workshops and brought that back, and that process was really interesting, partly just, you know, what you do with sort of images and different things that you draw out of it, but also, I suppose, how you as an artist approach this. We're all researchers, we're sort of trained to look at some evidence, make an argument, write an article or something similar. Obviously, an artist doesn't tend to do that. And it was really interesting. I thought the different themes that you brought out, something like more than human, was a really interesting way of approaching some of that and bringing all that together, I thought.
Thank you. I mean, did you find things in the PGR records which surprised you?
One of the most interesting findings for me personally was, you know, some of the career trajectories of these researchers. So, for example, I found, I mean, there was a student who was a geologist and whose career was in geology for the most part, but then eventually he changed fields into spirituality, which, I mean, thinking about sort of the connection between science and spirituality was quite interesting to me. And it was definitely not something that I would have imagined finding when I sort of went into the research. So I think that for me, it was to see the way that some of these PGRs, they sort of develop their careers after graduating. And for me, personally, that was definitely a very sort of surprising element. And I've definitely talked about this with my team so much, so they fully recognize what I'm talking about. So yes, I think for me that would be it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think, to be honest, what I found surprising about the whole project is also what I found surprising about the research. The ties that can be made or that have been made in the past between different researchers. And I definitely found that when we brought Sophie on board in the project, us having worked together as humanities students and then bringing a science PGR on board and thinking about what her experiences are within a completely different faculty and a completely different way of researching. And I found that really interesting to be mirrored in the historical research that we were doing. So particularly, I think there's probably a common thing within the sciences that people work collaboratively on research projects in research groups. That is not necessarily as kind of prominent in my experience of research. It's definitely, yeah, more of a kind of exciting side note rather than the central part. But for so many people in the past, whether it was in the sciences and in their research or in their lab work as they went on afterwards, so Evelyn Joyce Beryl and Mary Carlton carried on working together in labs for kind of security reasons in the social context that they were working in, which was a very male-dominated environment, or people working together in more kind of extracurricular pursuits, so Leo Palmer and Frederick Stretton Wallace doing the caving and speleological work together. There was so much collaboration in what was obviously quite a small cohort of students as well at the time in comparison to now, which I've definitely felt kind of ironically mirrored in our experience of doing this research that I haven't felt elsewhere in my PGR experience.
Thank you. James, anything to add?
Yeah, I think what I found the most interesting and surprising was the extent of international links. So there were 145 PhDs at Bristol over this 20-year period. 17 of those were international students from India, China, European countries, the US, and elsewhere. But they are often also, I really liked how that linked in with very local areas. So the Indian students, of which there were 7, almost all had research linked to Long Ashton Research Centre. And that became a real sort of centre of imperial links as well as sort of international coming into the local in a very clear way like that.
Thank you. Bryony, can I ask you first? I mean, our records, universities allows it, recording their own history, I will say, as a historian. But Bryony, are there other things, because the records are so patchy, are there things that you would have liked to have found out?
I mean, yeah, like just so much, and I think we all kind of feel this in terms of we'd love to know more about the personal stories. But yeah. I think one of the things, like thinking about the last film and its failure just at the end, is I'd really like to know what happened to the people who didn't complete.
Yes, yeah.
And what they went on to do, and what their reasons were for not completing their studies, and yeah, what fields they maybe moved into, and what the future held for them.
Thank you.
I think that one of the most interesting things for me as an international student was to think about how the experiences of international students must have been at that time. Especially because, of course, there was no video calling, there was no sort of, I mean, it wasn't the same sort of context, both historically as well as in terms of technology. So I think that one thing I would have really liked to find out was just the sort of candid experiences of students, definitely in general, but also particularly international students, and see how they navigated the more sort of delicate aspects of PhD research, such as just taking care of mental health and homesickness and all of these sort of aspects. There was during an archival research process, so I went to the special collections and I found some really interesting pictures, and some of them depicted, these just very candid pictures of students just being in labs, or, just very candid images, and it made me really want to see more of it and sort of just get a better sense of that picture of how they lived their lives as PGRs in Bristol, far away from home. So,
thank you. Lena?
I think I'd like to know why people were doing these degrees, particularly at the beginning where it wasn't a requirement to go into academia because there had to be a first PhD at some point, right? So the people who were teaching them didn't have PhDs, and funding opportunities were not available in the same way as they are now. I mean, there were scholarships, we uncovered quite a few scholarships, but that wasn't a kind of common thing to be able to access in this period. So it was a lot of investment, and people have gone on, that we found, have gone on to do such a wide range of things. To what extent was that a kind of requirement of getting those jobs, and why did they want to do these degrees? Was it just for the kind of intellectual pursuit and the enjoyment and love of the subject, or were there other things at play there?
Great point. Thank you. James?
Well, I think first we had a conversation with Sophie yesterday, and she said something really interesting about wanting to know about some of the pitfalls of this. I think this was mentioned in one of the films, but basically you've got people when they start and you get the title of their PhD. Yeah. Now, I mean, there are many PGRs in this room. My title changed about 37 times. There were so many pitfalls and different routes that you go down, and so many dead ends, which is all just part of the nature of research. So I thought I'd bring that out, which Sophie said. But then, and to be slightly greedy, I have two. One of which is personal lives. we get tantalizing glimpses of different bits in different record cards, and some people have sort of more complete papers. So there was one, Herbert Pike, who went on to become a nuclear scientist. He was present at tube alloys and aldermaston and everything like that. But on his student card, you have a little note that says, was severely reprimanded for calling up the warden of his hall, as if from the police station. And I just want to know what? What did he do? And what was he making an excuse for? And then the other one is, so much of this research was so tantalizing, it gave you little glimpses of different things, but it's about some of the concrete links with Bristol. So I think Brian, you mentioned that there was a concentration of soap research in the 1920s, and we think we can link that to one professor in the chemistry department in the 1920s, James McBain, and his PhD students. But we can't find any concrete link between that and the very large soap factory in Broad Plains in St. Philip's. And there must have been other sort of industrial links of a lot of this research, but where are those sort of concrete connections? I suppose I just want to do some more research on it, really. But.
Well, this project was designed, I hoped it would be a start and not just a close as well. One final question for you. Bryony, in fact. I mean, you've worked with the universities before, haven't you? Do you have any particular reflections on the cultures of research that you find at universities? Or even particularly about this one?
I feel like I need to be really careful answering this question. Well, I have to say, this is the first project I've made where I've been truly embedded within a university. So in the past, I've worked with individual academics or with specific archives. So this is the first time that I've really been embraced by a research group. But at the same time, within other projects, I've been involved in lots of other kind of more informal or, let's say, formal research groups or clusters. And something that I guess a common thread within those experiences and also within this research is, and I think this is something that everybody has said today, including Hugh, is the importance for cross-disciplinarity and collaboration. And how important that is within these kind of contexts. And I think specifically this project and just the process actually of working with these folks has really shown me how important that is. I guess that's my reflection.
Thank you. Lovely point. We now have some time if any of you have any questions for the team on their work, on the films. We have some roving mics. Hi.
Hello, I'm Farid Abraham, and I'm from School of Earth Sciences. I'm a geologist, so I'm doing on the climate change stuff. So basically, it's a very great movie. Looking at inspiration of, in the past 100 years of PhD research in Bristol. I was wondering what's going to happen in the future, the next 100 years. Are we going to sort of the evolutions directly from what you said about, for example, international students? In the past, we didn't have all the technology, now we have. Do you think we're going to have that sort of end product, which is the sort of what you find striking on your research? And then the other question is that I was wondering, because most of the research, if you're sending your thesis at the end, you put the acknowledgement. So do you think that what you find out in the past, which is on the collaborative approach, do you think is something very, in terms of collaboration is becoming something that we can actually follow? For example, is it being better now, or we are still on the same stagnant collaborative approach in the past and also at the current one? Thank you. I hope you understand my question.
I think on the acknowledgements, it's really interesting. Within this research, the extensive acknowledgements that you sometimes get, quite rightly, on modern PhD theses is something quite a modern phenomenon. They didn't tend to be written in the same sort of way on theses in this sort of period. On the technology front, I honestly don't know where PhDs and PGR research is going to go. In some ways, maybe this is just having done a PhD quite recently. I think they're getting harder. Harder. Because
you would
You
have, well, I would say that, wouldn't I? But you have to master so much that's gone before you get to a certain point that you can do anything new. In some ways, if your field is relatively new, you can jump in with some big questions that people have sort of worked out as the field is sort of being established. But if you're trying to master what has happened over the past 100 years, to work out where any of your research or where your original contribution might fit, that is becoming, I think, harder and harder and harder. So the very nature of what a PhD might contribute is, I think, changing. What that will change to, I have no idea.
Thank you. I think we have another question here.
You mentioned, Lena, during your conversation, that the question why, which is like showing the motivation and inspiration of PGR students. Yeah. So could you please share with us, have you found some interesting like points, and is it like, was it like, you know, what kind of motivation drives like others back into that early years? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think from the traces that we have in the archives, there's such a diverse range of occupations and research that people go into. And as James was saying, a lot of the international students, particularly from India, were associated with agricultural research in the UK. So we're kind of interpreting that there was maybe a kind of drive to do that kind of research within the context of India and move over within the context of empire, which is obviously something we've been thinking about as well, as the kind of problematic context in which these researchers were operating in the past. Beyond that, there were other scholarships. So there were the miners' scholarships that we uncovered, where children of miners would be able to get scholarships to come and do postgraduate research at the university. So like, there are a lot of different kind of social economic contexts that these researchers were operating in that might have stimulated reasons for them doing research. But in terms of the kind of personal drives and motivations, we just don't really know. We just don't really have any information on that, because we just have record cards and photographs and the written information about them completing their thesis. So I think getting more of that, experiential evidence would be really, really interesting, and is one of the kind of difficulties and pitfalls of historical research in a lot of ways.
I think we have no more questions, so we have a panel coming up which might engage even more deeply with the future of the PhD question you asked. So I'd like to thank you all again for marvellous work and really interesting discussion on behalf of everybody here. So thank you. If you are studying for a PhD, do help historians in the future. So write down your motivations, write your memoirs, please. Our PhDs have left their mark in strange ways, some strange ways. In a primary school in Thailand, there is a statue to our first Thai PhD student. There's a street named after one of the first 7 Indian PhD students. And of course, one of the 20th century's most important spies was a PhD student here as well. But less said about Klaus Fuchs, better. Thank you very much, everybody. This whole enterprise has been a wonderfully productive collaboration between the Bristol Doctoral College and our University of Bristol Institute as well. And I'd like to invite the Institute's director for a few months more, Tim Cole, to come in and lead our next panel and introduce our speakers.
I'm going to ask you a question about motivation, because we need to capture this. Kerry leaned over and she said, we need to capture now what motivates students to do a PhD. So our first 3 pieces of evidence lie before us. What I wanted to do was maybe just as a way of introduction to ask each of our panelists to tell us a little about themselves through their PhD story. So we've got 3 people on the panel. Just here next to me is Kerry Facer, who many of you know. Kerry's in the School of Education. She's Professor of Educational and Social Futures. And then next to Kerry is a newcomer in many ways to our region, and a really welcome newcomer as the new GW4 director. So it's lovely to have Dr. Jo Jenkinson with us. And then some of you may know Ben. Dr. Ben Miles is CEO of a spin-up science, but formerly of this parish, and someone who is really interested in the intersections between research and enterprise. So maybe I could ask you just to introduce yourselves by, one, telling us why did you do a PhD? Two, what was the PhD on in kind of like language that I could understand? And three, what do you feel like the PhD and that training has given you since? How has it kind of shifted and changed you? Jo, are we okay to start with you?
Yeah,
It'd be lovely.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jo Jenkinson, Director of the GW4 Alliance, which brings together the universities of Bath, Bristol, Cardiff and Exeter. I guess a career in academia was never kind of planned for me. That's not what I thought I'd do. Nobody in my family had been to university. So I didn't know what a PhD was until I was kind of part way through, I guess. But I loved science, I loved research, but wasn't sure about academia. So I did a master's at Long Ashton Research Station. I did a master's in crop protection, and it was still a really international kind of course then. And then did a PhD down in Exeter in plant pathology. I loved it. I loved the kind of science. I loved being in a group of people who were kind of passionate about a topic, really international team. But I didn't love the specialization, so I was kind of working on one particular pathway in one particular organism, and I kind of missed the breadth of undergraduate study, I guess. And so I think my skills were a bit different to lots of people. I was like super organized and kind of did those crazy experiments that involved bringing the whole lab together to work together on a topic. So my PhD supervisor suggested research management as a career for me, and I think it's been a fantastic opportunity. I've done so many different things. I get to speak to really smart people who are kind of passionate about their topic on a daily basis and dive in and out of all sorts of different topics. And done all sorts of things, from kind of writing the MRC's mental health strategy to designing the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowships. So yeah, it's been a kind of fascinating journey for me.
Great, thanks. Maybe Ben, motivation, the PhD in a kind of nutshell, and what do you feel like it's given you? How's it trained you?
Sure, yeah. My name's Dr. Ben Miles. Hello, everyone. Motivation for doing a PhD, I think I liked the idea of having a job in the future was probably one of the main motivations. I think that is a reasonable one for most people. Two kind of answers to that, I guess. I always, since the age of 11, liked the idea of becoming an academic professor. 11-year-old Ben thought that would be fun. The more reasonable answer was when I finished my master's here, I went through the kind of interview training that they give all graduating master's students, and my interviewer was like, that's the worst interview I've ever sat in. Would you like a PhD? To which I said yes. So my PhD broadly was in optical physics. I worked in the Nanoscience group. I was based out in lovely Langford because we were drilling into the NSQI at the time, so we moved all the quiet stuff out to the vet school. And really the utility of doing a PhD, I think, was, one, it's just exceptional training in learning how to learn anything. And I think it gives you a really luxurious opportunity to dive deeper into a subject than you will ever be allowed to do ever again, particularly if you ever think about moving into industry where you need answers quickly that are timely, that have some cost-benefit analysis to digging any deeper. It gives you the opportunity to look at a problem and really try and fully appreciate it. And honestly, the best thing about that is that you can then pick up that skill and apply it to any other subject that you would possibly like. Because you've hopefully gone to the point where you're world leader-ish in the subject area that you're doing the PhD in, maybe not quite, but then whatever you turn your attention to next, maybe you don't get to, best in class in that particular category, but you can get to 80% knowledge exceptionally quickly. which is really useful regardless of what avenue in life that you want to take. So that would be my thoughts.
Great. You're really selling the PhD, both of you. Let's see if Kerry continues. So Kerry, don't let me down. I've known Kerry for a while, but I've never ever asked you what motivated you to do a PhD. So I'm kind of intrigued about that. I think I know a bit about what your PhD was, but what do you feel it's also given you?
Well, so this is clearly the olden days, because I got my first academic job without a PhD. So I was an unemployed arts administrator living in Glasgow, having a really fabulous life, but I didn't have any money. And I saw a job as a researcher at Bristol University, which I applied for, and I got, and it was brilliant. So my first job was actually working as a researcher, studying children's use of technologies in the home and trying to understand what they were doing. And I've been doing it for a couple of years, and somebody said, well, you know, you really ought to get a PhD. I was like, no, I'm going to go off and do something else completely. But they basically persuaded me to do it, but then I did go off and do something else completely. I went off and worked for an independent research lab for a few years. And I did my PhD part-time alongside. I never did the kind of 3 years intensive work. I learnt my craft as a researcher as part of a project with professors doing live stuff and writing papers. I wrote a book before I wrote my PhD. And so my pathway to this has been slightly different. The PhD was, in the end, I ended up generating a whole new corpus on political and media accounts of ideas of childhood and how ideas of childhood were changing in the era of new technologies. And so what I got, I think, is very difficult to tease out the difference between what I got from actually doing the PhD itself and doing the live practice. But in terms of the formal training, I remember doing a course here in Bristol where I was taught the history of social sciences. And the critical thing I got from that was the awareness that the way we generate knowledge changes over time, and that we have choices about how we produce knowledge. And I think that when I think about how I work with my students, when I think about how I work with other people outside universities in terms of producing research knowledge, I think that's what is really critical, is that reflective awareness about the process of producing knowledge, and that we have choices, and that we don't just do the first thing that comes to us. I have to persuade most of my students that doing a survey is not the same as doing research, okay? Because there is the assumption that that's what it is. So that, for me, is one of the real critical qualities of a PhD, is the understanding that there is a repertoire, that we are constantly making choices, and that we have to think about and account for what we're doing. So, yeah.
Great. Now, I'm really intrigued about what the three of you are going to say next, because in many ways you've all had a really interesting set of kind of different careers that have gone before the PhD and through the PhD and after the PhD. And what I'd love to ask you is to think forward. So Hugh's challenged us to think 100 years, but we can go a little bit closer to the present if you want. We've thought back to the first PhDs 100 years ago. What would your vision be for the future of the PhD? Like, if you could make a PhD anything, what would you make it? Like, what would you imagine a PhD might offer? Would it be part-time always and embedded, or would it be full-time and focused? Is it narrow, or is it broad? In what ways does it intersect with others? So, you know, if you could just kind of dream for a moment, what would your dream be, the sort of dream PhD? Kerry, should we start with you on that? Where would you take us?
Well, I do have futures in my job description.
Exactly, that's why I started with you.
So it's part of my job to think 100 years, or maybe even further ahead. And one of the things when we do that is we also think back. So if we think about what's happened over the last 100 years since that, I mean, we've had huge changes, radical transformations that we couldn't have envisaged. So I think one of the critical things we need to be aware of is that your PhD shouldn't be developing you or training you for the university as it is now, but as it is for living in a world that you cannot imagine right now. If you can imagine it, you're wrong, okay? So critically, a really great PhD training will not just educate you for a university as it looks at the moment, and I find that really, really important to stress to students. But I suppose I do have a responsibility to think about some of the trends that we're looking at, some of the things that we're looking at over the next 100 years. I think we're going to have radical transformations in how we think about knowledge, where knowledge comes from, what sorts of knowledge is valuable and important. We're going to have potentially significant environmental disruption. Let's look at what's happening with climate change. What sort of world are we going to be living in? We've got potential huge geopolitical conflict. It would be an unusual 100 years if we didn't have any, so let's just assume it's probably going to happen. And we've got technological changes that risk completely transforming our idea of what it means to be human. So if I think about what a PhD ought to look like, I think it needs to, one of the critical things for me, for academic community, is international collaboration and international back channels, right? So even when politicians are all about encouraging us all to kill each other, academia is behind the scenes, building relationships, building connections. So your international networks as a PhD student are at the heart of creating a safer and a better world. So building international relationships is absolutely critical. I think understanding and thinking about what it means to be human. How does your study help you do that? And how do you think about who you are as a human being? That feels critical. Collaboration feels critical. And the capacity to imagine a different world also feels critical. I slightly worry that our PhDs were really good at studying the evidence and what's already there, but the imagination is equally as important. So thinking about how we support all of our PhD students, whatever discipline we're in, to imagine alternative worlds and then work with each other and work internationally to bring them into being.
Great. Ben, you can do 100 years or you can come closer. Your choice, but okay. I want you to think future. What would your dream PhD be?
I guess a stronger connection to, have to be careful about how to phrase that, reality, the real world, I guess. I think the PhD is exceptionally fine-tuned at preparing you for an academic pathway. You emerge from it oftentimes with a very good list of papers to your name, some conference attendances, hopefully a good ability to stand in front of an audience and vehemently defend interferometric cross-polarization microscopy. Doesn't come up that often, but it's a skill that you develop. But actually your ability to map that seamlessly into industry or many other walks of life actually isn't that easy, I found. Very rarely did any of the things I do in a PhD actually come up in any of the industry interviews that I ever went out and did. And I think that's a shame. One, because, well, like half of PhDs graduate and then emerge and look for jobs outside of academia. So it's important that we prepare people not only for the academic track, but also for the wider track outside of that, just so they have that utility behind them. But equally, because the whole point of all the great stuff that we do within universities is to develop solutions and ideas around how to solve big, important problems. And if we don't have a good utility of the people that have that knowledge in their brains, in how to extract it and actually implement it into change that they want to see in the world, then we can write some fantastic PDFs, but we don't necessarily have the people that actually can go out and then enact it. And I think that was oftentimes the piece that was missing. I very much hit the end of the PhD, lifted up my head and said, oh, okay, well, rent's due in a month, I should probably find a job. Didn't necessarily like future forecast as to, you know, setting some things up in parallel. And I think a stronger connection to working alongside, you could call them industry, you could call them startup groups, you can call them just the outside world as a whole, would have been really beneficial, because then I would have been able to kind of penetrate what the outside world actually was and how to interact with it. I think like everything that is fantastic about university that keeps you very safe and protected and allows you to study very deep. Also, if you then find yourself looking for something outside of that area, kind of holds you back in working out what is actually right for you. So I think breaking down that barrier is really important, because it means that you have better graduates, better knowledge exchange, internal and external to the university, and hopefully better PhD experiences.
Great. Joe, it's your turn to dream about. It's interesting, isn't it? Not just the research, but the researchers. In a sense, I think a lot of what you're focusing on is the kinds of the training, the people of what a PhD student looks like.
Yeah, and I guess my my reflections are probably kind of more on that kind of practical kind of element, in terms of, I think we've made great strides in moving away from kind of PhDs being a kind of lone, isolating experience. Kind of the work of the doctoral colleges and the kind of cohort building have really tried to kind of embed people more in a system. But there's clearly more to do. I did a piece of work with Research England where we kind of looked at how postgraduates access mental health services, and they often get caught between kind of not feeling like they're students and being able to access student services, but then also not being staff. So there's clearly more to do in that space, and I think the kind of what Ben was saying about we've probably a lot more to do about kind of careers advice and careers kind of access and what that looks like. Because most of the people that are around you have stayed in academia and have gone down that track. And actually that's not what the majority of people end up doing. And there's a huge sense of kind of, for a lot of people, a huge sense of failure when you leave academia as if that's, you know, something we shouldn't be doing. And I think we've really got to move away from that, because we need PhD trained people who have those kind of critical and analytical skills that that experience gives you in all walks of life, in civil service and whatever it may be. So that's an area I'd really like to kind of see change quite rapidly. And then finally, the diversity. Clearly we have to get there is so much to do in that space, and a lot of things that we need to address.
I want to ask you more about that in a minute, but Kerry, do you want to add in something else?
Well, one of the things that really worries me is that we are clearly recruiting large numbers of students to do PhDs, and there are not large numbers of PhD jobs. And one of the consequences of that is that it can push a drive towards an acceptance by anybody, once you get your first academic job, to accept anything, to accept any job, to accept any pay and conditions, to accept any sort of relationships, and to think that you need to exploit yourself. And that, to me, is dangerous. It's dangerous not only for you as an individual, it's dangerous for academia. Academia needs to be well-resourced. It needs to have respect for people. It needs to have respect for their time and their relationships. And so for me, absolutely critical, not just for the individual, but for the academy in the future, is that we support our students to know that they can do other things. Because there's nothing that makes you more vulnerable than to think you can't walk away. And I think anybody who is doing a PhD can also do other stuff. And then it means also you come back to the academy because you know you love it and you want to do it, not because you think it's your only choice. So that, to me, is a really critical thing, and it's to do with what do we think our universities are for, and what sorts of principles and practices do we want to embed in them as we develop.
And I think that does take us nicely into diversity, because that kind of structural context, that economic and structural context, is really critical, I think, in the diversity question. And I was struck, Joe, that you mentioned that you were the first in your family to go to university, and so obviously the first in your family to do a PhD as well. And I guess your own reflections, you know, especially because of the work that you've done within UKRI, you've had a lot of experience within the funding councils. What can we do, and what do we need to do to ensure diversity? And I guess it's partly as well setting it in that sort of structural context, isn't it, about actually the nature of the PhD and the nature of the job market, which are important things for everyone, but are maybe particularly important things for students that are coming from backgrounds where there's not a lot of wealth, you know, inherited wealth, where you actually need labour to, you know, in the old Marxian sense, that you don't have anything but your labour to sell. How do we diversify the PhD?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's diversity in all its forms, isn't it? It's kind of inclusion of ethnic minorities, it's socioeconomic diversity, it's thinking about kind of age diversity and experience diversity, and how you have that kind of permeability between academia and industry. And I think that probably does require a kind of real stock take of, is the current model of kind of PhD kind of fit for purpose, because it does tend to rely on, you know, the majority of people are kind of coming straight out of undergraduate or kind of master's degree. The kind of model does lend itself to you not having kind of caring and family responsibilities, or not having a long-term chronic health condition, given kind of access to sickness benefits. And we lose from that, right? We lose from people who've got that lived experience in who are then undertaking kind of that research. So I know that kind of UKRI are kind of launching into this huge project to look at a kind of new deal for postgraduate researchers, and the University of College Union have called for postgrads to be staff. And whilst at one level, I think that's kind of terrifying because it's kind of such a whole-scale change from where we are now, when you've been on the end of kind of some of those individual requests, as I was when I was at MRC, and I was the head of capacity and skills, and you've got an individual whose child has died and they're not entitled to bereavement leave, or then when you take it down to those individual levels, I think the time is right for us to really think about kind of what is the right model going forward.
Ben, maybe ask you about that question, because I know obviously you're really interested in brilliant people with brilliant ideas, because that's your business, is in a sense connecting them with investors. How do you get a really broad pool? Because the most brilliant ideas probably come from a diverse pool of candidates. What's your sense of what we can do there?
Yeah, I guess there's kind of two pieces of that puzzle. One is, how do you open up the gates wider so that we can get more people in? But equally, I think like the other end of the funnel is probably quite important to think about, like the output. And one of the key, most PhD students finish and they say, okay, well, either I'm going to get a postdoc, or maybe I'll go into publishing, policy, or become a patent attorney. And that's like quite a narrow set of things that you really view yourself as being, qualified for. Actually, I really want to see the equation changing so that, the PhD just means that now in front of you, you have basically any opportunity in front of you, whether you want to be a CEO, or whether you want to go work in a technology company, or go into policy or patenting, or any of those kind of other pieces. And I think by reframing that proposition, people also understand getting into it that they should be looking at the output. I think it's so easy, and maybe that's where a lot of kind of the difficulties people find as they go through the process. It's so easy when you're in a PhD just to put your head down and try not to think about the future, and just try and produce papers, and just try and get results, and just try and do all those tick box exercises that you're supposed to do, and not future forecasts, like I said, about what the end goals actually are. And changing that kind of narrative around what the PhD is supposed to prepare you for probably is a way to make it more attractive, because equally it's disingenuous if we're trying to bring people that have had whatever difficult circumstance to open the gate up to be easier to kind of enter into. If there's no opportunities at the end, then we've actually done them a huge disservice, right? So I think it's really important that we fundamentally change the middle piece of what the PhD actually is and what it allows you to then go on to do in life. And that you shouldn't feel quite as self-limited as you are, because actually you're perfectly positioned. You've just survived off £16,000 a year. You're perfectly positioned to do literally anything. Anything will be a mild improvement to that, So really, I think that would be a better way to kind of construct that argument. And equally, you've been exposed to some of the most, cutting-edge, world-leading ideas. You're a diamond at that point. Go start something really interesting. I think that's a better way to kind of frame the whole experience of the PhD. The job is to go out and do something interesting and unusual beyond, not to follow the kind of sequential track.
It's the one thing we haven't talked about, is it? The life lessons learned from living on a PhD stipend, valuable lessons that you take into the rest of life. Although, Carrie, you were doing it part-time, and I don't know if that's part of your answer. Like, I'm interested in your own reflections about part-time PhDs, and it's, in a sense, that model that you had about how the kind of structural stuff of the PhD needs to change to fit with this kind of diversity question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so many of my own PhD students at Bristol are part-time, and they're stunning, and they bring a huge amount of life experience, and the research that they do is completely different from the students who come at the age of 21 straight from a degree. So I think we're losing out by not offering part-time by default and a slower process, because there are simply huge numbers of people who can't participate as a result. I suppose I'd like to drop it into the wider context of what do we think the university's relationship is with society as a whole. And one of the things that I know lots of us in Bristol have been working on for a long time is think about how the university responds to questions that there are in the world. So how might we imagine a PhD process that allowed somebody living in a community, for example, that is struggling with various forms of disadvantage, or various forms of, imagine chemical pollution, and you're sitting there and you're saying, look, this stuff is happening and it's happening to my kids. How do I learn about it? How do I find out more about it? And I think what we need to do is think creatively about how people can come to us with questions, connect with us as co-researchers, community researchers, possibly support the development and skills abilities alongside that, and then have a pathway from that into a longer term, maybe part-time PhD. Because at that point, what we've got is an ongoing relationship between ourselves and the world. And this goes to a really fundamental question, which is we think about education as though it's this thing that happens from, 5 till maybe 25, and then you're done. And we all know that's nonsense. This is not how life is. And the problem is the PhD is still stuck in that model. It's like you do all this stuff, then you do your PhD, and then you go off, and then you're done. And it's not true for all of us in whatever stage. We've got to keep learning. We've got to keep thinking. We've got to keep connecting with new ideas. And so there's a lot of work being done on rethinking education as a whole fundamentally, to think of it as a lifelong process. And once we do that, and we start saying, how do we design a higher education system? How do we design a PhD system that invites people to participate later in life? Then you've got a very different basis. And I've just spent 2 years in Sweden, and the situation there is very, very different in terms of PhD students. PhD students get a really good salary. There are fewer of them. But the flip is they get a really good salary. They get benefits. They're part of a research team. They're publishing before they finish. And very, very often, they will do it over a much longer period of time. And it creates a completely different dynamic. And I don't know that that's the right answer here, but I think it's time for us to ask some really fundamental questions about our PhD model. And this is a creative opportunity to start doing things differently.
I love it. Final question. And in a sense, I think you've already started to hint at it. So I'll start with you, Kerry, which is, I think this question about, well, who gets to decide what the research question is? Because I think you're already starting to move in those ways. Because we could, in some ways it could be a thing that, like in many ways our model is often that in the sciences that the prof decides what the research question is. In the arts and humanities, I decide what the research question is as an individual student. But there's other players, aren't there? There's other stakeholders. And I wonder if you can reflect a bit on who should decide the research questions for the future of the PhD. So 20, 30 years' time, who do you want to be deciding what research gets done by PhD students? Kerry?
I'm actually pretty old school about this. I think there is a dialogue between the knowledge that has gone before and the world and the challenges and the person that you're in front of. And there's a brilliant essay by Hannah Arendt called The Crisis in Education. It's written in 1959. And she talks about the relationship between the knowledge that's already happened and the new person that enters the field. And this, for me, is what any form of education or research is about. It's a dialogue between the new person who brings a new insight and a new idea and a distinctive life experience and the body of knowledge that already exists. And our challenge, I think, is to create conditions where we have a conversation between those two things and create something new that couldn't have been foreseen by any of us. It couldn't have been foreseen by the individual, and it couldn't have been foreseen by those who, if you like, are guardians of the field. Those two things together, I think, start creating seriously good research and really serious education.
Which is a nice thing for James to hear as he changed his title 37 times. That's part of that kind of dialogue,
So
isn't
did
it? That dialogue. Ben, who should set the research questions?
Good question. I think, I don't think any one group in particular, right? And I think already the metrics have changed. The things that have made this generation of academics successful and rise through the ranks will be utterly different to what makes this current generation of PhD students successful and rise through the ranks. Already we're seeing things like impact factor, like patenting, like if you have a spin-out company associated with your work. All those things are things that are tied into the real world. And there's a lot of utility in those things because it gives you potentially an industry group to interact with that also can give you an additional kind of funding stream potentially. So it's a balance, right? The government puts funding into different areas at different times because it's looking to see a return on that investment. If you look at something like nanoscience took a huge slump in funding because we'd been funded for quite a long time and we didn't really do anything with it, but we had a great time. Whereas you look at things like synthetic biology or quantum, which have really started to convert that knowledge creation process into commercial validation of those ideas and actually moved them out into the world. It's those academics and those academic groups that are rising through the ranks very quickly and becoming very successful. And that trend, I think, is going to continue because it's a feedback system, right? You have little companies that sit on the outside of those academic groups that then hire PhD students in. It's what we did when we were sitting in Xylo. It's the first thing that we did. We thought, work with the university. It's where all the great knowledge is, and create strong links between industry and the academic institution. So I think, increasingly, regardless of whether we want it to or not, where the research directions will go, and maybe I'm talking specifically around the hard sciences, will be in the direction where there is commercial opportunity to then do something with them. And hopefully that also means that they overlap with solving big problems, climate change, pandemics, all of those sort of pesky problems that we have to deal with at the moment, which is good and bad. I think Blue Skies research is great, but equally I think research that solves problems is quite useful. So we have to balance between the two.
So we got quite a different answer from Ben to Kerry. So Joe, I'm really intrigued where you're going to go in your answer to that question.
I mean, I think one of the privileges of a PhD is it's that completely curiosity-driven kind of period. So you may have a kind of loose question or topic, but to me, kind of where it works best is it's an ongoing dialogue, and that relationship changes over the period. So to start with, it's kind of more direction from a supervisor, but by the end of the kind of experience, it's very much driven by the individual. And I think having the freedom to kind of pursue what you find most interesting and the kind of what you're most curious about and where you want to go is an amazing privilege. And I guess that's why at UKRI we were constantly kind of pushing back against the ideas of having PhD students on grants with fixed deliverables, so that you didn't lose that opportunity, so that that person wasn't tied to any particular outcome or metric and could really pursue their passion. And I think it would be a shame if we lost that kind of fundamental part of it.
Great. We should open up. We've got a little bit of time, I think, for questions. So it'd be lovely to... we've got an amazing panel here, so pick their brains. Hugh, you might want to know what the PhD's going to look like in 100 years' time. These guys will tell you. They're the right people to answer that question. So if there's roving mics again, just kind of signal with your hand. And we've got a little bit of time for questions that are more future-focused.
Kind of aimed at Joe, but other two, please chime in. Should UKRI make PhD students employees of the university?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that project's starting, right? They're going to look at the kind of postgraduate New Deal and kind of what that looks like, and that's absolutely on the table. The reality is that there's only a certain pot of money, and it would be more expensive. It would mean kind of fewer PhDs. That might be the right solution. Or there might be more that we can, there might be a kind of hybrid, and I think it's really timely to look at that for kind of all the reasons that we've raised during these discussions. I'm not sure it's kind of quite, there's no simple answer, right? Otherwise we would have done it already. But I think it is right to kind of to look at the model and really think carefully if that's kind of what we want as universities, if that's the way we want to support and train people. So that didn't really answer your question, but I think that it's such a complicated thing. It's got to be really thought through. But we can do better than we're doing at the moment, and maybe staff is the answer. I'm not sure it solves all of the problems, and it certainly means far fewer PhDs because of the kind of the financial challenges facing the sector. So that's an important consideration in that balance, I think.
Kerry, do you want to come in there? Because you've been at Uppsala and now Gothenburg, so you've got kind of a sense of a couple of different Swedish universities where, that, as you said, that is very much the model. What's your feeling of the pros and cons?
The model there is it's a much smaller university sector, and you have fewer students. And actually, they still hit the trouble of transitioning into a job at the end. So it's there. I suppose the question goes to the heart of a real tension around, is a PhD an educational moment or is it a research moment? And I think in some situations where PhD students are being used effectively to do the labor of the lab professor in service of them, then I think actually this is a job. I think there are different sorts of PhDs and different models across the whole university. So I think it isn't as simple as one way or another. And I think we need to interrogate all of those. I think there's some really quite serious ethical questions around this. But there's such confusion about whether this is a research position or an educational moment. And it's probably because our language struggles with it. I mean, I always see this as an apprenticeship into a community and an apprenticeship into a form of practice. So it isn't just an education, as in the way in which we're monetizing them right now, but nor are you a kind of fully qualified researcher, because we're going to have to provide you some support. So for me, I would rather think of it as an apprenticeship into a craft practice, because research is craft. You learn on the job and you get better at doing it. So I would rather think of it in that sort of model, and I think there's probably some interesting examples around apprenticeship models that we could look at to help us with this tension around should they be a paid or employee or not.
Robert, do we have time for one last question, if there is one?
I remember stocking up on ink cartridges to print out, I think it was 3 copies of my PhD for the examiners. Is the format of the PhD going to be different in 100 years, or what it is? What's it going to be?
Great. So is it 80,000 words in soft binding originally? What's your sense of the format, the output? Ben, what do you want? What do you want to examine in 100 years' time? Maybe we'll say 50 years' time.
Good question. I think I got lucky with my PhD, so I'm a bit biased. I like the idea of stapling papers together and then handing them in. And not doing a big write-up at the end. I think that's streamlined, and it also gives you like deliverable milestones that you can kind of pencil in, and gives you confidence that you are going to get the nice piece of paper at the end of the process because you've already done some nice deliverables. I think having those sorts of stage gating systems really helps.
Joe, what do you think?
I guess I would like to see kind of more flexibility in what that looks like. If you are bringing people in kind of who've got experience in industry and then are coming in to do a kind of part-time PhD alongside that, would that the kind of current thesis format probably isn't fit for purpose. Not that many people are probably that lucky to produce kind of load of papers that they can staple together, and then does that drive kind of publishing in kind of smaller journals, and actually would you be better saving the information for kind of one big impact paper? So I don't know, I think some diversity. I think that kind of goes to the heart of the different models and the different kind of, maybe it needs to be more subject specific, right? Maybe good practice needs to be developed in different areas rather than kind of having one model of what you produce at the end.
Which we have a little bit at the moment. We have practice-based PhDs, don't we, where there might be a kind of body of work with a kind of theoretical set of reflections. I mean, the Swedish model is interesting, isn't it? Because in Sweden, your PhD is a book, isn't it? That it's published, it's the university imprint, and then it's kind of in a sort of some form. What's your sense, Kerry, of the...
Well, I'll take 100 years seriously.
Good.
And say, we don't know what tools, technologies, practices, processes we're going to have available to us, but what I hope we are able to have is, we don't know if the university in its current form will continue to exist. What I do hope we will have is some way of supporting people to engage in deep, sustained thought that asks really challenging questions about the world and opens up new possibilities in whatever form that takes. And I really hope that that privilege is not restricted to a small group of people. So whatever form it takes, I hope we have a very, very wide range of people engaging in it. And I hope it allows us to continue to think hard and think deeply in whatever format, post-human or others, otherwise, we may have in 100 years' time.
Great. Passing from the Professor of Futures to the Professor of Pasts. Robert, do you want to say a few closing words? Thanks so much.
And thank you, everybody. I mean, thinking about the university in its present form, of course, the vast majority of those 11,000 PhDs have walked up there, received their degree, and walked down here. Or maybe it was the other way around at some point, which I think is a fabulous thing about the continuity of university history for all of those people. And of course, many thousands more postgraduate researchers doing MAs or other research degrees, and of course many thousands, tens of thousands more of our undergraduates, many of whom have engaged in research, most of whom have engaged in some sort of research as well, have sort of graduated in this room. And I think we should remember all of that. And Lena, you also asked us to sort of think about the non-completers, but the people who decided to take their research skills elsewhere and who were on many of the papers published in this university in the 20s and 30s for a wide variety of reasons. And for those of you from China, the first Chinese PhD student walked up here and around here in 1935, 1936. So 85 years ago, went on to become very important in the establishment of a geological research institute in Shenyang in northeast China. And is quite prominent in his field. So we have 85 years of a Chinese PhD history as well. Thank you, panelists, panelists future, panelists past. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Bristol colleagues, Tim, and the colleagues who've also supported the team behind the scenes as well. Thank you, Bristol Doctoral College colleagues. Taz, Paul, Lucy, Rachel is here, Ivan is here, Kevin is here. Thank you for the fabulous work you've done to get this event here tonight, and for the fabulous work you've been doing since the establishment of the college, those of you who've been here, but especially for the fabulous work you've done over the last 2 extraordinary years in supporting our PhD students through this crisis. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions and for your attention. It's been great to have you here. We now have plenty of food, and we have plenty more, I think, to drink. We had the building until 9 o'clock. But what I hope you feel revved up to do now is talk about what you've heard. Come and talk to the panelists, grab them, ask them what they mean, why they said that. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer, or else they'll scuttle out very, very quickly. So thank you, everybody. And we have the films will be properly, I trust, on the website and viewable in their entirety. Apologies again for that. So we'll be sharing the link. It'll either come up here. We're also, we'd like to capture some of your thoughts about the PhD. There is an online form that you can sort of fill in, share some reflections, some questions, some provocations, object to what you've heard, share what you think, suggest. This ought to be, and I think still is, an arena in which we can contest in words, and that's what a university is, in arguments of all sorts. You can find out more through the short links there, and if you're a tweeting type, please use that hashtag. So thank you very much, everybody. Don't run away. Sit and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.